What happened on October 7 is that the very essence of Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people, defending Jews, defending the people who live in the homeland, that failed. The state that is Israel failed its citizens, and they were taken sometimes in their pajamas to Gaza and to the tunnels and to the dungeons of Hamas. And the very thought that they would be left there, or Israel will not do anything in its power to get them back. And by anything, I do mean anything. That includes, if needed, military action, if needed, compromise. This is simply in complete contradiction of the Israeli narrative of the Israeli society. And this is not a sentimental issue. If you want everybody to be on board in the Israeli society, if you want everybody to fight, or at least those who are fighting, those who are contributing to continue on, they need to know that the state is behind them, that the society will do everything to get them back, because this is such a difficult and tough neighborhood. And therefore, getting the hostages back and fulfilling the commitments made to their families and to them is not an addiction to sentimentalism. It is a very clear-eyed and cold understanding of how the Middle East works and what is the difference between Israel and sometimes between its enemies, and how the Israeli society can regain its strength after such a trauma of October 7.
That is Israeli journalist and scholar Nadav Eyal speaking about the urgency of bringing the 101 hostages in Hamas captivity home. In spite of its quite stunning string of military successes in recent months, both in the Gaza Strip and Lebanon, Israel is tormented by the fact that these hostages languish and are dying in Hamas tunnels. This imperative of bringing them home is based not only in human compassion, but also in the founding and core ethos of the State of Israel, that it exists, first and foremost, to provide a safe haven for Jewish people. And for that promise to be meaningful, it must be backed by a government and society that will do everything possible, and then some, to protect its citizens and soldiers. Nadav and I dig deep and focus on why the hostage issue looms so largely, and will continue to do so until they are rescued. As with everything in this complex region, that entails a careful analysis of so many factors. Among them, Israeli domestic politics, the role of Qatar as a critical intermediary between the terrorist groups and the Western Alliance, and in particular, America. But we begin with a discussion of Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader who was assassinated on October 16th in a spectacular, but quite by chance, series of events. Israeli troops were doing a routine patrol in Rafah when they happened upon a small group of terrorists, 3 in all. The ensuing drama has been well documented. The 3 split up when they realized that the IDF was closing in on them, likely thinking that if there were 3 rather than 1 target, it might increase the possibility of 1 or more of them surviving. Things didn't work out that way. 2 of the men were bodyguards, in charge of the close protection and security of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, who had eluded Israeli forces for more than a year. He died alone, badly wounded, covered in rubble and dust, and defiant. His face was totally covered by a cloth mask in order to avoid being recognized during his forays above ground. Sinwar was known to have spent long periods in the tunnels, and it is believed the 6 Israeli hostages who were murdered at the end of August were used by him as human shields. There is speculation that as Hamas realized that the IDF was closing in on their hiding spot, that the hostages, by then emaciated and weak, did not have the physical strength to move themselves to a new location, hence their brutal murders at point-blank range. The Israeli media is reporting today that they had subsisted for months on energy bars only and were dangerously dehydrated and malnourished. Sinwar, of course, escaped the tunnels and has likely been in and out of the network since that time. But the IDF continued to close in, methodically scouring every patch of Rafah. I first met Nadav Eyal almost 10 years ago when I was the Canadian ambassador to Israel. He was a prominent journalist who continues to stand out for his depth of analysis and the way in which he articulates Israeli politics and the geopolitical issues in the region with such elegance. We begin, Nadav and I, with a deep dive into who was Yahya Sinwar and how did he see himself and what made him tick. I'm Vivian Berkovich, former Canadian ambassador to Israel, and now working hard to make sense of the incomprehensible. Stay with us. It's Sunday afternoon, just before 3 p.m. in Israel, which means just before 8 a.m. in New Jersey, where you, Nadav Eyal, have really gone out of your way and made yourself available. And State of Tel Aviv thanks you for it.
Thank you so much for having me, Vivian.
You, of course, are a man who wears many hats. At the moment, you are with your family on a 1-year special appointment at Columbia University, which we'll talk about more in the podcast notes. But you are also a senior columnist with Yediot Achronot, if I'm not mistaken, the newspaper in Israel with the largest circulation, right?
That's right.
Yeah. And yesterday you wrote a column about the death of Sinwar, and it's actually just a beautiful and profound and deep and moving column. It raises many difficult issues for Israelis and I think for the West. But I really wanted to dive into that because I think that the way in which you present and discuss the issues is really important for people who live outside of Israel to understand. You know, you talked about, just to begin, the hugeness, for lack of a better word, of Sinwar's death and the many implications and potential consequences. But before we jump into that, I found your synopsis of who the man was, what he represented, the cruelty with which he lived, not just towards Israelis and Jews, but his own people. And you said he wants to be a modern-day Salah ad-Din. Would you mind trying to present that issue and aspect of Sinwar that may not be so familiar to people inside of Israel?
Yeah, so Yahya Sinwar began his career as the Hamas operative operating in Han Yunis, in the Gaza Strip. Incredibly hard conditions and a hard place to begin with. And he was one of the first activists, young activists, to join during the Intifada years to Hamas, and began his career really in the 1980s by investigating and torturing and sometimes killing Palestinians that were collaborating with the Israeli occupation in Gaza. And he was sentenced to prison time by the Israeli military judicial system during these years for murdering Palestinians. He was nicknamed the Butcher of Han Yunis. And this was not a nickname that he got from the Israelis. It's something that Palestinians called him. So he was known for his cruelty, decisiveness. People who knew him during his prison time in Israel, I'm talking about people from the Shin Bet and from the Israeli defense apparatus that spoke with him. And there is a lot of contact going between Palestinian prisoners from terror organizations and between Israelis during their prison time. Sinwar learned Hebrew. He studied academic courses, Israeli academic courses during his prison time. So they describe him as very smart, intelligent, free, cold, strategic, And one of the things that are interesting about him is that he sometimes seems to be completely reasonable, and then he presents views that border on the messianic, thinking about himself as a man who can actually deliver not only his people, but the entire Arab nation from what he describes as Western colonialism. So this man was, as far as he was concerned, a revolutionary. And as far as the Israelis are concerned, and of course, most of the West, the leader of a vicious terrorist organization.
Which you likened to a tornado, the effect that he and his Islamist Hamas and other colleagues had on society, certainly in Gaza and beyond. The Salah al-Din reference. Tell us about that. Before we continue with Nadav, I wanted to be clear that in his op-ed piece published on Saturday, he referenced the fact that Sinwar at times liked to compare himself to the legendary historical figure, Salah al-Din. He has been known to self-aggrandize in this way, placing himself as an equal among the greats of Islamic culture and history. And I was interested in hearing Nadav Eyal elaborate on this quite important aspect of Sinwar's persona.
Salah ad-Din is the man who founded the Ayyubi dynasty in Egypt and in Syria, and he is known around the Muslim world and Christian world based on his leadership and success mainly against the Crusaders. The thing about Salah ad-Din is that, unlike Yahya Sinwar, there are also a lot of stories about, including, by the way, in Christian history, about how he was, to an extent, merciful. Some of these are, of course, romanticizing his figure, but Salah ad-Din is definitely not known in historiography, and we should say that this is the 12th century, right? We don't know anything for sure. He's not known for his intense cruelty or being a psychopath, quite the contrary. But what's important here to remember is that for Yahya Sinwar, it is his idea of being a Salah ad-Din because he thinks about Israel as a crusader state, infiltrating the region as a foreign power, and of course, it being temporary. Yeah. And this is a known theme in the Arab world and by some fundamentalist Islamists, the idea that Israel is just like the Crusaders. It came for a short time. It managed, like the Crusaders, to form a polity, but this polity will eventually disappear. And Yahya Sinwar saw himself as the man who will lead to that polity being severely beaten or disappearing. And this was actually what happened, of course, with Salah ad-Din, the Battle of Karnei Chitin, which was the most important battle between him and between the Christian Crusaders. So for him, he thinks about himself or thought about himself in these kind of grand terms of someone who will change history.
As did Sinwar, of course, but as you point out, he had a reputation for being very cruel with respect to suffering that he and his regime visited upon his own people.
Yeah, of course, Palestinians are a main victim, Palestinian people, Palestinians, Gaza, are a main victim of the Hamas rule. And the reason for that is that he saw that Gaza is being virtually destroyed by this war. And he knew at any given point that he can stop the war by releasing the hostages and, to an extent, agreeing to an idea that was floated by the Israelis since the beginning of the war that I reported at the time, was never denied by the prime minister, and at a certain point was said publicly by Gal Hirsch, who's the prime minister's envoy to the hostages issue, the possibility of the leadership of Hamas leaving the Gaza Strip after they release the hostages and receiving some sort of an immunity in return for ending the war. And this is something that was floating since the beginning of the war, but of course Sinwar was the major block to it and thought about himself as someone who will never surrender. And he did. He never surrendered until his last moments, something that is now being glorified in social networks by his supporters.
And of course, the idea or approach that, as you're saying, was being considered from the early days of the war, that Hamas lay down their arms and be exiled from the Gaza Strip, basically is the mirror image of what happened with PLO in 1982 in Lebanon.
Absolutely. And that was the model. But like the PLO and Yasser Arafat left Western Beirut before Israel actually took effective control of it. And in order to prevent the casualties there, this was,
we're long past that. We're a year away. And I'd like to turn now to what is really the most pressing, in my view, existential issue for Israel in the moment. And that is the return, the rescue, repatriation, whatever word you want to use, of the 101 hostages. And now here we are a year on, still waiting to bring these people back. And you say at the end that revenge, which is the killing of Sinwar, is not a day of victory. The return of the hostages is the victory. And it's the victory of the truth. Why do you see this issue of bringing home the hostages as being such a core issue for Israel?
I don't see the killing of Sinwar as a revenge. I used a Hebrew term called Yom Nakam V'Shilem, which is from the Bible. But the killing of Sinwar is, it's very far from being a revenge. It's a very effective, legitimate tool in war to kill the leader of the military organization fighting against you. Sinwar was a highly qualified military commander. He led the October 7 attack. He promised to do that again. He had the aim of destroying the state of Israel. So the hit on Sinwar, it was a very logical, very far from revenge, but it was also a revenge. Returning the hostages is crucial for the Israeli society for many reasons, but one of those, or the most essential of those, is the basic Israeli agreement of solidarity that stems from our long history, our long Jewish history. כל ישראל ערבים זה לזה, וכל המציל נפש אחת כאילו הציל עולם ומלואו. One of the things that both true to Israel and both true to the Jewish people is that solidarity is key to survival. Solidarity is key to survival. Jews didn't survive as individuals. They survived as communities. When they turned into only individual survival, this could have happened, but at many times at the expense of their identity. They needed to convert, or they needed to disconnect from their own communities. So this virtue of solidarity facing a world that was many times hostile against Jews is essential for the Jewish experience. But it was even more essential when you live in the Middle East and when Israel is in such a difficult neighborhood, something that former Prime Minister Ehud Barak once described as a villa in the jungle. When this is the case, one of the essential elements of the Israeli agreement, the creed of Israel, is that it's one for all and all for one. Now, it's never the case. If you look at this, there are people like the ultra-Orthodox that don't serve in the army. There are, of course, 20%, even more than 20% of Israelis who are non-Jewish. But this is the narrative of Israel. This is the mainstream narrative of Israel. And this means that if a soldier is held captive by Hamas, like Gilad Shalit at the time, Israel, led at the time by Netanyahu, will release 1,017 prisoners, Palestinian prisoners, hundreds of those with blood on their hands, murderers, so that one soldier, Gilad Shalit, would return back home. Now, in retrospect, that might not have been a really good decision. And I'm saying this as someone who thought that Netanyahu was right in that decision. I'm not only criticizing him, I'm also criticizing myself as a journalist, because I thought in my op-eds that Netanyahu wasn't wrong about this, but one of those prisoners was Yahya Sinwar himself. The reason I bring this example is not in order to relitigate the Gilad Shalit deal, but in order to say something that is really very fundamental about the Israeli experience, and that is we want to believe that we get everyone back home, and we want to believe that no one is being left behind, and this is not a slogan. This is a policy of consecutive Israeli governments. One hostage that fell in Lebanon to the hands of a terror organization, Ron Arad, a former pilot of the Israeli Air Force, became a national tragedy. The fact that his fate is still unknown became a wound in the Israeli society. Everybody knows who's Ron Arad, and he's just one person. And what happened on October 7 is that the very essence of Israel as a homeland for the Jewish people, defending Jews, defending the people who live in the homeland, that failed. The state that is Israel failed its citizens, and they were taken sometimes in their pajamas to Gaza and to the tunnels and to the dungeons of Hamas. And the very thought that they would be left there, or Israel will not do anything in its power to get them back. And by anything, I do mean anything. That includes, if needed, military action, if needed, compromise. This is simply in complete contradiction of the Israeli narrative of the Israeli society. And this is not a sentimental issue. If you want everybody to be on board in the Israeli society, if you want everybody to fight, or at least those who are fighting, those who are contributing to continue on, they need to know that the state is behind them, that the society will do everything to get them back, because this is such a difficult and tough neighborhood. And therefore, getting the hostages back and fulfilling the commitments made to their families and to them is not an addiction to sentimentalism. It is a very clear-eyed and cold understanding of how the Middle East works and what is the difference between Israel and sometimes between its enemies, and how the Israeli society can regain its strength after such a trauma of October 7.
So here we stand 1 year later, and 101 hostages remain in Hamas captivity. How would you summarize the manner in which the government has dealt with this issue to date?
First of all, it's a two-way street. It takes two to tango. There's Hamas here and there's Israel here. And I'm not going to be simplistic about this. It's very true that at certain points it seemed that Hamas doesn't want a deal. Hamas was led by the psychopath, by Sinwar. And they were, with no doubt, trying to play with Israeli psyche and with Israeli public, using the hostages for psychological blackmail, using the hostages in order to have more friction within the Israeli society. And after saying this, I, as someone who has been covering this since the beginning of the war, and I published specific stories, it's not my position or my opinion or the newspaper. Some of this is based on specific facts that I published and facts that others have published, like my colleague Renan Bergman, that works in Yediot Achronot and also the New York Times, is that at certain points, the government was much less aggressive than it should have. And at certain points, it seemed that the calculus of the prime minister is more political than the welfare of the hostages. And I can bring specific examples, for instance, how there is a very secret meeting in which Israel decides on its positions, its minimum positions for negotiations with Hamas, with a specific number of hostages that is the bare minimum that Israel will agree. At least this Hamas will need to release. And then this gets leaked to the outer cabinet in Israel, which actually means that it will be leaked to the press. And then after a few minutes, it's being leaked to the press. And Hamas hears through the media what is the secret position of the bare minimum of Israel. And how is it leaked? It's leaked through 2 or 3 people that were in the meeting. And I will say gently that it's leaked through right-wing ministers to the press, as far as I know, and I think I do know. And I describe this as just one period of time. And then, of course, there's an uproar in Israel. Why would we agree to this number? Because it's not presented as a bare minimum. It's presented like this is the number of the hostages released. This is one example. Another example is how public are the statements, the continuous statements of the government and the prime minister every time there is negotiations with Hamas. If you're negotiating with Hamas, and one could argue that you shouldn't negotiate with Hamas on the fate of the hostages. One could make that argument. I don't support it, but one could absolutely make that argument. And some people in the Israeli sphere might make it. I don't know. But it's not the argument of the prime minister. And then there are negotiations with Hamas led by the US. The prime minister says, we want these negotiations to conclude in a good way with another deal. And then we see public statements by Israeli officials or by the prime minister himself as to details or strategy that is deliberated in the negotiations with Hamas through the mediators, Egypt, Qatar, and the United States. So if you want to get a deal, you don't use this kind of deal that is very sensitive for the Israeli public and very sensitive in terms of Hamas. If you want to get as many people as you can out, you usually don't discuss it in the media. And this didn't happen once. It didn't happen twice. And I can go on. Now, it is just a fact, and people can make up their own minds, that if the prime minister would have reached a deal a few months ago, his government would have collapsed. It's just a fact that the government would have collapsed. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the far-right Kahana disciple, would have left the government, and maybe Smotrich would have left the government, and that would be the beginning of the end for the government. Each listener to this podcast can make his own mind whether or not Netanyahu was as serious. Polls have shown that about 50% and more of the Israeli public thought or think that he is thinking about his political interests more than he is thinking about the interests of the country in reference to this issue. So this is what I'm presenting now it's not a fringe position within the Israeli public. Now, after I said all this, was Hamas serious as to a second deal? I don't know. And I'm not making the argument that it's the fault of Netanyahu. I'm not making that argument. I am making the argument that Netanyahu as a leader did not manage, and his government did not manage to convince the families of the hostages, and between 40 to 55 or 60% of the public, depends on what poll you're saying, that they're serious. And my point is that if you want to retain the cohesiveness of the Israeli society, one thing you need to do, you need people to be convinced that you're serious about this issue of getting the hostages back. And just by the end result, they didn't manage to convince the Israeli public with that. Now, this is, again, not to say that it's not Hamas to blame. Maybe it is Hamas to blame. But this was exactly why people like me were saying, so make a very good offer. Now, I should also mention that the US is saying in the last couple of months that there is only one side to blame, and that is Hamas. And the US is saying this flat out. And I've heard this myself, and I'm also writing this. So what I just described to you, Vivian, is a very complex state of events with no clear kind of consequences. But one thing that I do think needs to be emphasized, you win these kinds of wars also on the way that there is communal trust. There is society's union and resolve. And I think we are very lacking at that. I think that the military and the Israeli Defense Forces in general are doing a much better job since October 7 and are improving and are changing. And I think the jury is still out as to our political leadership, to say the least.
And you make the point in your piece as well, and I expect you'll reiterate that today, that this is truly an opportunity to do the job, put aside any political issues, political cynicism, and ensure that we do everything possible to bring the hostages home. What would you hope to see happen in the coming hours and days, which obviously are going to be critically important to that effort? What would you like to see happen to bring them home?
I think that, and I think this might happen. I think that the Prime Minister might understand this from what I'm hearing, that now is the time for a deal, that Israel needs to be much more aggressive, needs to be on the initiating side of a possible deal. I think that the best would be a regional deal, which will lead to a different government in Gaza. A different government in Gaza is Israel's winning the war. A possibility to normalization with Saudi Arabia is Israel winning the war. Implementation of UN Security Council decisions as to Lebanon and Hezbollah stopping its shooting at Israel that it began on October 8th by attacking Israel is Israel winning the war. And we need to see these things. And mostly, of course, the return of the hostages is Israel winning the war. I think this is essential. And now is really the time for regional leaders and Israel leaders to show that they can deliver. Look, they got a platform from the Israeli defense apparatus, right? Look at where we are at. It's not that the Israeli political leadership, they should be, and I wrote this, those who were responsible for October 7 should be also credited for the success in the last 2 months. I don't think that these success since July, I don't think that these success can ever erase the failure, as you said earlier, the failure of October 7. But the bottom line is that now there is this sense that the axis of resistance, actually the axis of terror, has been severely handicapped, beaten by the Israelis, not completely, not to the verge of their defeat, but this opens a window of opportunity. And it is now for American leadership and regional leadership and mostly Israeli leadership to show what they can do with these new cards that they've been handed by the Israeli Defense Forces.
You said that Israel really must lead this initiative to trying to bring together a new regional reality, really, that would, of course, include the release of the hostages in Hamas captivity. And I'd like to ask you, when you speak of Qatar, do you see Qatar as an important mediator, which they are and have been? Do you also see Qatar as part of what you refer to as the axis of terror? But query, what's Qatar's role in this?
The Qataris are probably essential to get a deal right now. If you're asking strategically, Qatar, as far as Israel, is not playing a positive role in this region, right? Whether it is because of its very specific relations with the Iranians, its closeness to Hamas, the way that Israel sees Al Jazeera, and because of other elements, right? So that's quite obvious. But the Israelis are actually negotiating with Hamas. It's Bibi who negotiated with Hamas the first deal. It's Bibi who negotiated with Hamas transferring money from Qatar to the Gaza Strip. And this is where we are at right now. So this definitely shouldn't stop now before Israel gets its hostages back. As to the future, I think that the region needs to have a more of a clear-cut understanding what is the alliance of the moderate and what are the countries that are on the other side. And the axis, the so-called axis of resistance, needs to be severely limited in its scope of operations. And Qatar needs to make up its mind, the country that has the largest American airbase in the region on the one hand, and on the other hand, plays this game across the region. And, you know, I want to believe that one of the conclusions that they will reach after this war is that it is no longer sustainable for them. But this also depends not on Israel. Israel is really not important in that sense because Israel doesn't have a lot of relations with Qatar, right? The question is what the West would do, what the US, Canada, the EU what will they tell Qatar? Or will they continue on talking to Qatar as a sort of a mediator that doesn't have any sway or influence? Basically, people across the region and the world need to be held accountable for legitimizing violence. And this is very important, is that if we want to build a Middle East that would be strong and secure for everyone, including the Qataris, and of course the Israelis, the UAE, Egypt, Jordan, and all the rest, delegitimizing violence is very important. And it's becoming increasingly difficult because you see legitimacy to violence coming from other places. I saw on the social networks, on Twitter, I'm starting to see how people who are trying to support the Palestinian struggle are making Yahya Sinwar some sort of a Che Guevara of sorts. And this is very worrying because they are idolizing a mass murderer on the record with mass murder. I think unlike other leaders in history that were revolutionaries, then we learned that they were terrible figures. But in this case, we know everything we need to know about Yahya Sinwar now.
Nadav, you're saying that Israel really has to, use the expression, take this bull by the horns and take the lead and work with the EU, with Western countries, the US, of course, to move the Middle East to a new reality. And Qatar sits there in this kind of state of moral ambiguity from my perspective, playing both sides. And perhaps it's their moment of truth, as you were suggesting, that Qatar has to decide whether it is aligned with the axis of resistance or with the West. But Qatar is critical, essential to have online with the West to make any kind of deal to free the hostages. Wouldn't you agree?
Right now, no, I'm not sure I will agree. Right now, what Qatar needs to do is be effective in releasing the hostages. As to the West and the rest, this is looking into the future. Right now, Qatar can maintain its position in the region by both being what it is and by pushing for a deal, like it has done since the beginning of the war. Qatar has been pushing for these kind of deals since the beginning of the war. There's no doubt about it. The question is why, and the question is the long game. And there, I don't see them myself as a Qatar expert. I can only hope that they completely and utterly sever their connections with organizations or polities that are not only delegitimizing Israel, but are trying to actively destroy it. But this is my general hope for the entire region. So I'm not downplaying Qatar's importance. But what I'm saying is that since the beginning of the war, they wanted a deal. Again, some would say they wanted a deal because they thought this might get out of hand, it might jeopardize their own position, because they had political or financial interest with the deal, because they wanted to make the Americans understand how important they are. You can analyze this, but because, again, I am not a Qatar expert, I'm not going to do that. But right now, they want a deal. This is what the Israeli negotiating team is saying. This is what the Americans are saying. This is the operations of the Qataris since the beginning. Some people in Israel would say that the fact that the Qataris want a deal is actually a testimony that the deal is not good for Israel. That's something you hear sometimes in Israeli public discourse, because the Qataris are not our friends. But at any rate, I think that Israel should leverage everything it has right now, get the deal, get those Israelis that are in the Hamas dungeons being tortured as we speak, get them out, then develop a regional strategy on their expense, and not turning our backs to the failures of the state, of the society that led to their captivity. First of all, get them out. Then do the rest. There is a lot of time. They don't have any time left. They are dying. And this is the reason why it's so essential. And with them dying, something of the Israeli spirit dies too. And this is not magic. This is not talking about, again, a romanticism. This is what Israel is all about, making sure that these people are not being left behind. And it's more than a year now. And they are there. And many of them have already died. We are actually negotiating the return of bodies, not only of live people. So we need to get them out as soon as possible. Israel is strong enough. It has proved to be strong enough in the last months to get them out, to do what is necessary. Then again, build a regional strategy that will be overlasting, not the one that we have had until October 7th.
Nadav Eyal, as we say in Israel, from your lips to God's ears. Let's hope that they are brought home soon. Thank you so much for your insights today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me today.
And thank you for being here. For further information on Nadav Eyal, please have a look at the podcast notes. Until next time, stay safe, stay cool. And please check us out on social media. Our Instagram and Threads handles are at State of Tel Aviv, spelled out in one word, just as it sounds. On X, which used to be Twitter, you can find us at State of TLV. Aha. All right. Thanks again. Until next time. We love hearing from you, so please comment on our website, stateoftelaviv.com, or send us a note to hello@stateoftelaviv.com. On behalf of the State of Tel Aviv core team, Yon Zabo, our creative, graphic, visual, and marketing man, Amir White, producer and editor extraordinaire, sound guy, who is also impressively patient with me and my boomer tech deficiencies, and our social media manager who pitches in on everything, Maya Naftalin. Thanks to the team. Thanks to you for being here. We'll be back soon.